Hello everyone, this is Christy with myscrapbookevolution.com, and it's time for prompt 12 of the Stencilfied journal project. We'll be dipping my art journal in coffee. You heard that right. So stick around and see how well that worked and what exactly I learned about the process. So just to give a little recap, prompts 1 through 11 are available on my YouTube channel and on the My Scrapbook Evolution blog. This project's hosted by Tina Walker. She's a friend of mine who happens to be a columnist for Stencilgirl products. I'm not affiliated with Stencilgirl products, nor am I compensated to participate. I'm doing this for fun. So let's get into the process itself. And remember, sometimes I don't always follow the prompt to a T. I like to adapt them a little bit. And you'll see how I did that in this video. My journal sort of became a little bit of an Easter egg in a lot of ways. Now this isn't my first time dipping paper in coffee or tea. I chose coffee, and I'd seen a lot of tips where watercolor artists had used instant coffee. So I made this mixture with instant coffee. I added a little bit of lemon juice because I'm hoping that will prevent it from mildewing. And then I dipped some of my pages into it. I added a little white gesso. I'm hoping that I can have a sort of layered effect. I propped my journal upright to dry, and I let the coffee just sort of run down and out onto some paper towels. I can use the paper towels later on in another project. And I poured off the excess instant coffee into a bottle to save and use for ink later. Okay, so here is the art journal. It's dried. One of the things that you'll notice when you use coffee on it is that it may warp the pages a little bit. This journal is, once again, made out of an old art class catalog. It's from a local place here where I live, and I wanted to use it as an art journal. It has a nice pocket in the back of the cover. And what I did was I clipped a few of the pages, and I only dipped a couple just to see what would happen. Now I will say this, when I did it, I covered some of the pages in white gesso because I felt like that would contribute a little more to the interesting staining that I would get. And this page was not completely dry, and it took probably about 2 or 3 times longer to completely dry than the other pages did. So make sure any paint or gesso is completely dry before you apply it to the coffee stain. I had already, a long time ago when I started this project, painted the cover. So I came back in and I scraped a little bit of the gesso in here so you can sort of see the coffee staining on that portion of it. But I want to do a second dip with the stenciled item on it, and I'm hoping that it'll be just a little bit of a deeper, darker color. I may leave it in longer than 5 minutes. This is the mixture that I made. Just shake it up a little bit. It's very watery. It's in a bottle I had for making homemade ink. We took a class on that earlier this year with our homeschool group. And I'm hoping that having sat overnight, the instant coffee is just a little bit stronger. I've heard that coffee and tea can be mediums that you have to play around a little bit with in order to get the different layers and colors that you might desire. So this is all kind of a big experiment for me. It's something that I've wanted to do for a while. Anyway, let's get started. So for my second layer, I'm going to put this stencil over the top, and I'm going to just dip half this page in, kind of like half and half. This is the Stencilgirl Art Deco Borders. And here it is. I'm going to be using a very bright white acrylic. I'm going to see if that holds the ink color a little bit better than maybe the gesso did. White gesso is white, but it's not as bright white as this is. So there's hope for that yet. Another option might also be, and actually maybe I will put a little bit of that on here, some texture paste in white, and see how that reacts with the coffee. All of this with my art journal is an experiment, and depending on what it does means whether or not I may bring it to a canvas later on. So that is done. I think I'm just gonna let that dry. I kind of like the effect of that there. Let me get some texture paste and I'll do the front cover as well. I had debated with this image, I kind of liked it and I kind of am thinking about covering over it. The entire journal is essentially me practicing portraits, and they're kind of just a mix of whimsical portraits, somewhat realistic but not always. Some of them are a little bit of abstract style portraiture. So we'll just kind of see what happens, but I do know that on the cover somewhere for both of these I'm going to put another portrait. And I'm not sure if I'm going to paint this over or what I'm going to do with it yet, but we'll see as we go along. Okay, so I have my texture paste and I am just going to put a little bit here. I kind of just want the center circle, so I'm just going to kind of layer this in such a way that all we're going to get underneath it is that central circular design. Real quick, while I'm doing this, going to apologize if you hear any odd noises in the video today. There's some construction going on upstairs in the apartment above me. There's construction going on the main ground level, and my neighbor's kids are home today, so there's been quite a lot of interesting noises going on, making it a little bit difficult to record today. I'm just kind of rubbing in this texture paste. I'm not doing a very thick layer, mostly because I want to keep my book from getting too bulky. So once this is done, I'll just let it dry and then move to the portion where I dunk it into the coffee bath. As I sat there watching everything dry and just kind of waiting impatiently, I realized I did not like the image in the upper right hand cover. So I covered it a little bit with more gesso, trying to bring the same look that I had on the left side of the page over towards the right side. I used my palette knife a little bit. I scraped on some gold paint because lately I'm really loving gold paint. And partway through I realized maybe I should record this for you. Sometimes I just need to play quietly and allow myself to just add stuff without thinking too much. I am really loving running ink lately, so I keep dripping the ink on and turning the book and just trying to get it to run different directions and see if it reveals anything in the image below. Sometimes I use multiple ink colors at the same time. Of course, they can mix when that happens. In this case, I've decided to let the ink dry a little bit and add another color later, possibly after I dunk it in the ink. Now, some of it did run off onto the table below. I did my best to pick it up with the dropper and add it back onto the page. I don't like to waste product at all. I'm very budget conscious with my supplies. So when it started to become an issue that I couldn't quite get much of it back into the dropper and onto the page, I decided to go ahead and take another art journal and just press it down onto the page itself. A lot of times I have multiple art journals going. That's so that I can paint off any excess paint or stamp off any of the stencil images onto another book. It starts the layering process going and allows me to get my supplies to go a lot further. So dipping the book again proved to be a bit of a challenge for me. I kind of channeled the idea of dyeing an Easter egg, and I had this bowl, which ended up not being large enough, and this was the largest pan that I had. So my book was just not quite fitting in to dip it and leave it in there for the full 5 minutes. I wasn't going to get much of the coffee up onto the page. I tried spooning the coffee up over the top of the page itself, and it just really wasn't dyeing it a whole lot. I don't know if that would have worked if the coffee was a little darker. I just kept trying to spoon things over, and I kept trying to adjust how I could have the book sit. And I was really concerned that if I left it in there, if I weighted it down with something and just tried to keep it in there, that the page would warp so much that it would be difficult for me to draw on it and paint on it later. I realized that the page was already slightly warped from the previous dye job, so I just put a little bit of coffee over the top of certain sections and I let it sit there and stain things. Now I did, when I was done, pour off all of the excess coffee back into the bottle to save again for later. It soaked up a lot of coffee, the art journal did. It soaked up almost half of what was in the original bottle, which really surprised me. So that's something to keep in mind. And it does take a long time to dry. So when I finally got to this stage, I'm just adding in ink, putting in drops. A lot of times I use the ink dropper itself to draw onto the page, and doing that means that I have to do it in layers. I have to let different parts of the design dry in between when I'm working with them. It did take a long time for everything to dry, but the effects were kind of nice. There's a bit of the darker coffee here, and you can see it kind of went into the pocket and made an interesting design. I would definitely recommend folding paper and placing it into the coffee and seeing what you get there. It's finally time for me to draw the final image onto the page. I'll be working with gel ink pens and also with the same stencils I was working before, texture paste, and a little bit of acrylic paint and ink. And of course I had to give her a crown. I've been giving crowns to a lot of the portraits that I've worked on inside the art journal itself. Here I'm using texture paste over the stencil, and it was a little bit of a challenge. I couldn't quite get the stencil very flat because I am working on the spine of the cover. So I'm probably going to come back in with the paint pens and add a little more detail. You probably noticed I switched from the gel pen over to these Posca paint markers. The Posca paint markers just seem to be layering over the ink a little bit better than the gel was. It just wasn't sitting right with the gel. So I can come in and do a couple layers of that Posca paint pen. They're basically a watery acrylic, and give the detail to her face that I want to have. Sometimes I see images inside the ink, and what first came to mind here are that these kind of looked like little people. And then as I sat there thinking about it, I thought, well, that looks kind of odd, almost like they're worshiping her, especially since I put a crown on her head. And it didn't really feel right to me. And it took me a little while to figure out what I wanted to do in that area, or how I wanted the page to be. I kind of like that they're there, but I'm also not really liking the message I feel like I'm portraying. So what I did to try to figure out what I wanted to do, I covered up the basic parts of the people, trying to hide some of the details I had added in there, and I pulled out this older art journal page that I had completed within the last couple of weeks. I have some faces that I just randomly practiced creating in the background on this page, and I thought I would use them as inspiration for my design. I also felt like the opposite side of the cover needed a little bit something more, so I went back in with the ink and added in a few more drops down in the corner. I played with the idea of putting a stencil in, and that just didn't feel right at this moment either. So I've replicated the shapes of the drops on the other side. And once it's dry, I'll see exactly what I want to do with it. I've been trying to practice a lot more intuitive painting lately. And at the end, I decided that I did want those droplets to sort of represent people, but I didn't want to add more detail to them. I just kind of wanted them to be in the background. However, I still don't want it to seem like there are these people coming to worship the character on the cover. I added in a quote by Rumi, which says, "Silence is an ocean, speech is a river." because I feel like each of the characters that I'm drawing inside my art journal have something to say, and it's up to the viewer to interpret them. I felt like the quote kind of takes away from the concept that they're all coming to worship this person. Rather, they're coming to listen to what story she has to tell. So now I'm coming in and adding finishing details, and you'll see that my ink dripped onto the page. I didn't intend for that to happen, but I went ahead and left it. I'm just gonna let it be part of the design itself. I feel like it adds a layer in and just kind of brings her a little bit further away from the background. I did have to wipe off a small amount of the ink in a few spots, and you'll notice that I added in areas where I wiped some of that white ink onto others just to kind of even it out. And I've gone back over the quote with my black pen just to make sure it stands out from the background. Looking at the art journal cover as I'm coming to the end of it, I realize I covered a lot of those coffee stained portions up, and that's okay. It's just part of the layering process. Again, I think that if I wanted those coffee stains to show up a little more clearly, maybe I should have used watercolor paper. I'd like to experiment with that, and I'd also like to experiment with different concentrations of the instant coffee mixture. And here is the finished project. I will say that my art journal now smells a lot like coffee, so that's a side effect you can expect if you dip your art journal into a coffee page as well. You can see a close-up of this page along with the supply list at the My Scrapbook Evolution blog. I'll share the link to the blog post in the notes for the video. And now it's your turn to play along with the prompt. Stencil the front and back cover of your art journal, put it in a bowl of coffee or tea for 5 minutes, let it dry, and then decorate the cover. If you need some inspiration, I'll link up to Tina Walker's post in the notes for the video below. You can also search for hashtag #thestencilfiedjournal to see what others are doing for this prompt. Don't forget that if you make a project, you'll want to leave a link to your project in the comments for this video or in the comments on the My Scrapbook Evolution blog.